Hi everybody. I know it's been a while since you posted your Aristotle comments, but I wanted to get back to you on them. And I've gone through both classes, looked at all the posts, and identified a bunch of interesting, worthwhile comments, also some errors and misunderstandings that I wanted to be sure to clear up. So please take some notes on this and make sure you use this to get Aristotle down as clearly as you can, and if you still have questions, of course, send them along. Alright, so I won't use names here. I'm just going to grab out the ideas that I found from you all, and it won't be perfectly organized. It would take too long to get it all organized that way, but it hopefully will cover a lot of important ideas. So the first one is, I think it's interesting that he didn't exactly give a formula as to how to be a good person. He just kind of gave a broad description of how you could possibly be good or happy. So a lot of you said this. Most of you appreciated this. Most of you felt that the rules and formulas that Kant and Mill used were not always that helpful, maybe a little too limiting, and you rightly perceived Aristotle as admitting that he doesn't have a formula for life. As we'll see, he is very strict in other ways. Having a formula and following rules is not the only way to be strict, and he has his own version, we might say, of strictness, which some of you, I think, kind of understood and others not as much. Second comment, I found that when you gave the example of being less a baker or less of a friend was off to me. Just because you don't excel at something doesn't mean that you failed at it. For example, I might be making brownies. I take them out of the oven a little too soon. I didn't fail at making brownies. They're still brownies. Well, I think a lot of you made this kind of comment, and a lot of you were kind of offended, I guess, or you didn't like the idea that Aristotle would tell you that you could be a failure. And so I would say a couple things about that. One is, the misunderstanding is probably a bit due to my lack of clarity in the way that I put this. I think the simplest way to understand it would be to say the brownies that you made were not as good as they should have been. You admitted that you took them out too soon. So everything in life is going to happen on a continuum or a scale. And it's not just one horrible or 10 perfect. There's, of course, all kinds of degrees in between there. So I think the way I put it was a little too extreme, and it threw some of you off. You're either a complete success or a complete failure, and that's not Aristotle at all. Now, on the other hand, if you take the brownies out of the oven too often, you can't say you've made an excellent brownie. Better is better. Worse is worse. A little bit better is a little bit better. So Aristotle would say we should recognize, we should try to understand and recognize what is excellent in whatever field, whatever role, whatever circumstance we're involved in, and hold ourselves to that ideal of excellence. Of course, we're not always going to reach it, but we don't then get to say, well, I actually did well, right? I actually did an excellent job, when in fact, sorry, you took the brownies out too soon. So, you know, the fact that it's on a scale, on one hand, might make you feel a little better, because Aristotle's not walking around telling you bad person, bad person. On the other hand, if you're not at the top of the scale, he's going to say you're not excellent. So goes both ways. Okay, someone said his views are different from Kant and Mill because he thinks that you can be a good person or happy just by making yourself happy while not violating moral values. Now, I'm not sure where the person got this idea, but this is definitely not Aristotle. For what he means by human excellence is not simply selfishness. It's not merely self-centeredness. And it's not only avoiding harming other people. He has a much more positive, I guess I would say, view of happiness. And this will relate to some of the other comments as well. I think I mentioned this in the neat notes, but let me say it again and explain it a bit. One of the best ways I have of understanding Aristotle's view of human life and therefore of happiness is to remind myself that he was a biologist. And as a biologist, he would look at things like acorns and seeds, right? And children and ponies, or colts and foals, right? Young animals. He would look at all of them and see in them a potential. As a child, you haven't reached your potential. As a seed, you haven't become a flower. But there's something about you that already contains that potential, he would say. And so that potential is defined by the end state of that kind of thing. So if you're a piglet, the end state is a mature, healthy pig. If you're an acorn, it's an oak tree, right? If you're a child, a human child, the end point is a mature, fully grown, fully developed human being. So happiness has a kind of biological character where all of us should grow and flourish to become full, rich, healthy, thriving human beings, just as an acorn should eventually grow to be an oak tree. So in this case, in this sense, it might seem like Aristotle is focusing only on our individual happiness. As it turns out, he believed that we, like some other animals, but certainly in a much more profound sense, we were social creatures through and through. So what it means for us to flourish is not to be an individual. What it means for us to flourish is to grow into the relationships that we have and to become friends with other people and to be a good neighbor and a good citizen and to participate in the life of the community, to be involved in public religion and rituals in his time, and fight in the army if you need to. All of these kinds of things are public social things, and he thinks these are just as much what it means for a human being to flourish as physical strength and pleasure and things like that. So an oak tree has a very limited end point. The technical term is telos. The oak tree has a very limited end point it needs to reach, which is primarily physical. Our end point is physical, but it's also deeply social. He thought it was also political, etc. And so we have a lot to grow towards. And it's not possible to grow towards your full human potential merely by focusing on your own happiness. He thought if you do not learn how to be a good friend to others, you are a failure as a human being. Now, only in that sense. You could be excellent in other ways, but developing friendships and being a good friend is essential to human life, he thought. All right, so it's not just about making yourself happy. It is about growing and thriving, but as a human being, that involves understanding ethics and understanding your part in society. All right, I think this relates. It says his theory is holistic, and this would be perhaps another way of describing what I was just saying, that a theory that is limited, for example, Kant and Mill, from this perspective, from Aristotle's perspective, Kant and Mill focus too much on making the right choice, doing the right thing, following the rules. And Aristotle thinks there's so much more to human life and human thriving than just following rules. So he sort of takes the whole person, and he takes the person in the whole society, and he takes them over their whole lifespan and asks, how can we make this life, this human life, in its biological context, with its muscles and lungs and all of that, but also with its social context. How can we grow into a complete human being. Okay, Aristotle says, it takes much practice to be skillful and competent in all aspects of self and life. It's a beautiful sentence, really nice way to summarize things up. All aspects of self, so Aristotle recognizes, yeah, sometimes you need to focus on your own self, your own character traits, etc., for your own growth, but also focus on the life outside of you. And the key, two key ideas here. One is to be skillful. The goal is that you become better at living with others in society, playing your role in your career as a father, as a parent, etc. And in order to develop those skills, you have to practice them. This person says, I agree, everyone has their own story, but that's not without others influencing it. Stories continue to grow and build upon generations, and I believe it is a story that never fully comes to an end. People in our lives leave an imprint in our stories, and stories cover much terrain in all the components of our lives and the people in it. I think Aristotle would largely agree with that instead of this modern emphasis we have on the individual, my freedom, my life, my rights, Aristotle recognizes, as this person says, that people really leave an imprint in our stories. People shape who we are. The people who are close to us they don't just happen to be close to us, they profoundly affect and shape the kinds of values we have, the kinds of people that we are. Another person says, I love that Aristotle gives us some wiggle room. Okay. Another interesting point I don't think about prior to this, I didn't think about it, is that we are born into someone else's story. Very important point that we talked about earlier in the section on stories and then in the videos on Aristotle. Now, let me make one point about this. This is important for ethics in the following way. If, in fact, I was born into my parents' story, into my family's story, my grandparents and aunts and uncles, I was born into the story of my faith community, so all the people at church and all the people who shaped that part of my life. If I was born into these stories, and what Aristotle means is, those stories existed before you were born. Human life was happening, history was happening, religion was happening, the nation, United States, wherever you were born, that was happening. All those things were in place when you showed up. So you're born into these stories. And that that relates to ethics, specifically in the following way. Every role, so whether it's a fictional story or a historical story, the roles that people play come with expectations. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to play Hamlet, I'm going to play the role of Hamlet, and not pay attention to the whole play, not pay attention to Hamlet's character traits. You have to try to play the role as it's meant to be played. And that's what it's like to be a son, right? You're faced with a lot of expectations about what it means to be a good son. You have to learn how to play that role. How that relates to ethics for Aristotle, and I think for human life, is you don't get to define what is good and bad, right and wrong, or excellent in those roles. The stories already lay those out for you. In a sense, the script is already written. Now, you're an individual to the extent that you can play that role differently than other people, but there are a lot of things that just are out of bounds. As I said in the other videos, you can't walk around and say, I'm a great brother, but I don't have any, empathy for my siblings. I don't really care what happens to them. Well, people are going to say, what do you mean you're a great brother? You can't be a great brother if you don't have empathy. If you don't have some compassion, if you're not willing to listen and care about them. You can't say you're a great brother. So these roles come with built-in expectations, and this is how it affects ethics, right? So to be a human being is not only to grow biologically, but it's to grow socially with other people, and you're already thrust into a